Chapter 9 of Captain John Smith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michael Fazio. Captain John Smith by C.H. Forbes-Lindsay. Chapter 9. Guerrilla Tactics. Despite their superior numbers, the Turks forbore from renewing the battle on the day following the desperate struggle that was described in the last chapter. The Christians, completely exhausted, and many of them, like Captain Smith, sorely wounded, were only too glad of the respite. Thus, the contending armies lay in sight of each other for days without action on either side. At length, the Duc de Mercoeur saw a favorable opportunity for attacking, and did so with such effect that Hassan Pasha, after losing 6,000 men in this later battle, retired from the field and retreated to Buda. Relieved of present anxiety on the score of Alba Regalis, Mercoeur divided his army into 3 bodies and dispatched them in different directions. One corps, under the command of the Earl of Meldrich, was assigned to service in Transylvania. Our hero recovered sufficiently to accompany his regiment, which, as we know, could have ill spared so good a man. The winter had set in before the command arrived at its destination, and the Earl went into camp to recruit his depleted regiments and prepare for the ensuing campaign. The regiment of Meldrich, which had recently added so greatly to its renown, had no difficulty in getting all the picked men it needed, and in a few weeks had regained its full strength. With the opening of spring, Count Meldrich led his army into the wildest portion of Transylvania and began a vigorous campaign. The object was to clear the Turks off the plains and to take their chief stronghold, Regal, in the mountains of Zarham. The entire country was of the most rugged character, and it had been for years the resort of Turks, Tartars, and bandits of all nations. From this wild retreat they issued at favorable intervals and overran the neighboring valleys, destroying villages and carrying off their inhabitants into slavery. The fighting which Captain Smith and his companions in arms now experienced was the most difficult known to warfare. It called for courage and patience, strength and quick-wittedness in an extraordinary degree. Though he could not have suspected it at the time, the training our hero received in this campaign was the best possible to fit him for success in his future career among the Indians of North America, and in many a lesson that he learned in Transylvania was turned to good account in Virginia. During their march through the province of Zarham, the army of Meldrich never encountered troops in mass or in open combat, but were surrounded day and night by a foe invisible for the most part and appearing, when he did, in the most unexpected places. The road was through a country that afforded ample cover, and ambuscades were of frequent occurrence. From the shelter of a wood or from behind a hill, a band of horsemen would dart upon the column with the swoop of a hawk, spear the nearest foot soldiers, and disappear in the twinkling of an eye. These attacks were usually made in the uncertain light of the evening, when the Christians could not effectively use their pistols. Some 6 such onslaughts had been made with complete success when it occurred to Captain Smith that the dusk which favored the attack might be made an aid in repelling it. His plan was suggested to the commander, and with his approval was put into effect. It was ordered that on the following day the column should march with 2 ranks of men-at-arms at either flank, concealing a number of horsemen on foot leading their chargers. As the light began to fail, the Christian army approached a point where their progress would take them between a rocky eminence and a thick coppice. It was just such a place as the guerrillas would choose for an ambush, and every one was on the lookout for the expected attack. They were not long in suspense. As they passed the 2 natural hiding places, Turks dashed out on either side and charged upon the Christians with a shout. But before they could reach their intended victims, the concealed horsemen had leaped into the saddle, and, riding out between the files of foot soldiers, charged the oncoming enemy at full speed. The crash, as they came together, was terrific, and the lighter Arab horses of the Turks were bowled over like skittles by the heavy chargers of Meldrich's men. The surprised Turks were readily slain as they lay upon the ground or turned to flee. Very few escaped, whilst the Christians returned to their ranks without the loss of a man. After this decisive turning of the tables upon them, the Ottomans contented themselves with picking off stragglers and casting spears from a tolerably safe distance. More trying, however, than the ambuscades were the night attacks, for they not only occasioned serious loss of life, but, by robbing the troops of much-needed rest and keeping their nerves upon the rack, threatened the demoralization of the entire army. Night after night the Turks rushed the camp, cutting the tent ropes and stabbing the struggling soldiers under the canvas. The Earl of Meldrych was deeply concerned about these night attacks. He knew that unless they were checked his army could never reach the passes of Regal, much less effect the difficult task of taking the city. The general and his leading officers had several consultations on the subject, but without arriving at a satisfactory conclusion. One half of the force might have been employed to guard the other whilst it slept, but the day's march was so arduous that by nightfall few of the men were fit to stand. In this dilemma, the young Englishman, who had already done such good service for the army, came to the relief of his general with one of those practical schemes which he seemed to be ever ready to devise in an emergency. Following Captain Smith's suggestion, the Earl ordered that on the following night the camp should be pitched in a spot that would invite an attack by the enemy. The tents were to be erected as usual, but the 3 front rows were to be empty. Behind these were firmly stretched ropes at a height of about 2 feet from the ground, and extending right across the camp. Beyond the ropes was left a clear space of 20 yards, and along the farther side of this was drawn up, after dark, a body of 1,000 picked men. The lights of the camp were out, and the army was apparently sunk in slumber, when a large force of Turks galloped in among the tents and charged forward with their battle cry of Allah! Allah ud Din! God and the Faith. They expected an easy slaughter and escaped with little loss, but this time things were to fall out differently. The leading ranks of the Turks were in full career when they came upon the hidden ropes, and as their horses struck them they pitched forward upon their heads, throwing their riders at the very feet of the Christians, waiting with sword in hand to dispatch them. Rank after rank of the Turks rode into the trap, and fell atop of one another in a shrieking, struggling mass. Meanwhile, Meldrich's men-at-arms stabbed and hewed with might and main, slaughtering their enemies with a fury excited by the recollection of their nameless cruelties. By the time the less advanced of the Turkish horsemen, realizing that they were entrapped, had turned about, they found themselves face to face with a cordon of Meldrich's cavalry which completely cut off their retreat. In the end, the entire body, numbering about 500, was slain. In those days, prisoners were seldom taken in wars with infidels, and it was not often that the fanatical Turks would ask quarter of the unbeliever. After this affair, the march was resumed with very little interference on the part of the enemy, until the mountains of Zarham were reached. Here began the most difficult part of the military operation. Regal was situated in a small tableland which formed the crest of an isolated mountain. It was approachable only on one side, and the ascent must be made by a rough and narrow path. It is no wonder that the Turks deemed Regal impregnable, and entrusted their women and their treasures to the security of its position. The city had never been taken, and it is doubtful whether it would have fallen to a less determined and able body of men than the veterans under Meldrych. A picked force was chosen to form the advance guard, and John, in consideration of his recent services, was permitted to take his place in it. The work of this body was to clear and hold the road up the mountain, which was defended by the Turks with utmost obstinacy. Every foot of the way was contested, and the advance guard lost a large portion of its number, but at last it gained the top. The main body of the army and the big guns then made the ascent. When, after the weary weeks of fighting and marching, Meldrich's division camped in sight of the gates of Regal, it had dwindled to fewer than 8,000 men. The city was garrisoned by 20,000 Turks and had an ample supply of provisions. Under these conditions, the Earl entertained no thought of attacking it, but wisely contented himself with entrenching his position and repelling the frequent sorties of the besieged. In a few days, Prince Moises arrived with a reinforcement of 9,000 men and took over the chief command. The Christian army now proceeded to construct approaches to the city and to mount their guns in commanding positions. This work of preparation, which was performed with careful deliberation, consumed several weeks, and the delay tended to encourage the garrison. They foolishly attributed it to timidity and began to display contempt for the beleaguering army. They paraded upon the ramparts effigies of Christians hanging from gallows and shouted derisive messages to the besiegers. At length, this overconfidence of the Turks took a form that afforded the besiegers a chance to prove that they were still awake and prepared for action. One day a messenger from the city was admitted to the presence of Prince Moises under a flag of truce. He was the bearer of a lengthy document couched in pompous language, which, after reproaching the Christians for the lack of exercise that was making them fat and timid, expressed the fear that they would depart from the city without affording any pastime to the ladies of it. That this might not be, Tur Pasha, a Turkish general, challenged to single combat any champion whom the Christian army might put forward. The combat was to be fought after the fashion of knightly times, with which the Turks had become familiar during the Crusades, and the height of the vanquished, together with everything brought into the field by him, should become the property of the victor. The challenge was received with delight in the Christian army, and as soon as it became known, scores of captains pressed forward for the privilege of accepting it. In order to avoid jealousy and discontent by singling one out of so many brave men, the commander determined to decide the question by casting lots. Young John Smith was among the most eager candidates for the honor of representing the army, and his name and those of the others were written upon scraps of paper and shaken up in a helmet. It was a breathless moment when Prince Moises thrust his hand into the cask and drew forth the billet upon which his fingers closed. "John Smith, the Englander, is our champion," he announced to the throng, with a shade of disappointment in his voice. He had hoped that the honor might fall to one of his own countrymen, and although Count Meldritz had spoken with warmth of John's courage and prowess, the prince felt doubtful of the ability of a mere stripling to defeat an experienced warrior. As John was about to go into his tent, his heart full of joy at the wonderful good fortune that had befallen him, Prince Moises beckoned him to his side. It was in the mind of the general to ask Smith to waive his right in favor of some older and better tried captain. But the first glance at the young man's eager face convinced his commander that it would be useless to pursue the purpose. Instead, he inquired whether Smith's horse and equipment were all that he could desire, and what weapons he would choose, having as the challenged the right of selection. John replied that his horse had proved itself a trusty beast in many a sharp skirmish since the Battle of Guerilla, and for the weapon, he would name the lance, in the handling of which he feared not to pit himself against any mortal man. As he made this truthful but nevertheless somewhat boastful statement, John fancied that he detected a faint smile flickering about the corners of the prince's mouth. He flushed at the thought that his general might be inwardly laughing at his pretensions, and said, with some show of heat, "May it please your highness to give me leave to prove my quality with the lance?" The prince gravely assented to the proposal, and a soldier was dispatched to fetch the young captain's horse and tilting lance. In the few minutes that elapsed before his return, our hero's thoughts strayed to the period of his hermitage in the Lincolnshire forest, and he congratulated himself on the time then spent in the practice of a weapon that was fast falling into disuse. Hard by the commander's tent stood a convenient tree. From one of its branches, a soldier was instructed to suspend an iron ring, no bigger than a dollar piece, at the height of a mounted man's head. When this had been done, John, who was already mounted, took his lance from the attendant soldier, and placing it in rest, bore down upon the mark at full tilt. When he wheeled round and saluted Prince Moises, the ring was upon the point of his lance. "Bravissimo!" cried the prince with a smile of satisfaction. "I had not thought to see that feat performed in this day," he added, as he turned on his heel and entered the tent. End of chapter 9.